partners of the Coastal Landscapes Initiative, which hopefully you've heard of. We also call it the CLI, and it supports nature enhancing choices for coastal landscapes that will benefit everybody. It takes a lot of partners for us to be successful with our CLI work. Staff from the North Carolina Aquariums and from the North Carolina Cooperative Extension Program, as well as volunteers from the Native Plant Society, have been particularly important for the work we've done, and you're going to hear from some of them today. So we have an hour for presentations, and we're going to have 15 minutes at the end to answer your questions. Christy just mentioned that we're going to record this event, and we will share it out with you afterwards. We ask you to please remain on mute throughout the talks. If you want, you can also turn off your videos. And if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section. There's a little box up there that you can see. Just put it in there. Please don't put it in the chat.
And the one pepper and some.
So we are asking that you remain on mute if you can, please. We had over 500 people registered for today's event, which is great. And they're not only just from North Carolina, but from 13 other states. We have home gardeners, we have master gardeners, we have nurseries, as well as some landscape professionals that work on both private and public lands. So container gardening, as you all know, that's why you're here. It can be very fun, but it can also be challenging. And we do it for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we may not have the yard space to put something in the ground, or we don't have enough yard space for all the plants that we actually want to grow. We might want to beautify our patio, and a lot of people will use container gardens for their for an entryway, for a home, for a business. But traditionally, what we do with container gardens is we use non-native animals. But today, we're going to talk to you about how you can use natives so that you can be successful at using natives in container gardens. And there are some things that are just a little bit different about using them instead of the ones we traditionally use. So today's webinar is based on, and get my slide to change, is based on our latest publication called Greening Your Space, Creating Eco-Friendly Container Gardens for Coastal North Carolina. You can find this on our webpage, and I will replace the link in the chat because it was at the very, very beginning. You may not be able to find it. And it'll also be on the very last slide of the presentation today when we do Q&A, so you can get it from there. But you can find this and a lot of our other publications that highlight native plants to help them use them as well in your landscape. But what I'd like to do now, again, it's actually sort of introduce myself because I don't think I've done that. My name is Gloria Putnam, and I am with the North Carolina Sea Grant Program. I also help lead the Coastal Landscapes Initiative. I am here in Raleigh at NC State University's campus. I'm joined by Christy Perrin, who's also here in Raleigh. She's with Sea Grant and the Water Resources Research Institute. She's going to be monitoring the questions you put in the chat, and she's going to come back at the end to help us direct the questions. Now I'm really happy to introduce to you our speakers and also the writers of the publication that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. They're scattered all along the coast, and they actually have remote access. They will be controlling their slides remotely. So sometimes there might be a little delay. So just please just bear with us if that happens. So Carol Peoples is with the North Carolina Native Plant Society. She started and is co-chair of the Central Coastal Plain chapter. She's going to talk to us about the importance of prioritizing native plants in our landscapes. And Carol was one of the primary organizers and reasons why we developed the document in the first place. And our second speaker is going to be Emily Morrison. She's with the Onslow County Cooperative Extension, also a writer of our document. And she's going to provide us some tips on setting up and maintaining your containers so that they remain healthy and thriving. Our third speaker is going to be Rachel Veal. She is at the North Carolina Aquarium on Roanoke Island. And she's going to be talking to us about specific plants and plant combinations, and a lot of the photos that you see in her presentation uh, are ones that she took herself. So that will be, I think you really enjoy them. We need more great photos, and if you happen to have some, please send them along. And we're also going to get a cameo appearance from Monica Hunter. She's going to talk to us about some of the recent experience that the Beaufort Garden Club has had with using native plants and containers at pretty highly trafficked areas there in Beaufort, North Carolina. And as you might expect, container gardening in public places may come with some slightly different expectations, and she'll talk to us a little bit about that. So with that, I'm going to hand control over to Carol to start us off.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to see you all here. This is going to be a great presentation. I think you're going to enjoy it. In developing this resource, we really wanted to help people think about container gardening in a new way. We wanted to focus on making container gardening more eco-friendly and sustainable. But what even is eco-friendly gardening? It's a way for us to garden that minimizes the negative impacts and increases the positive impacts that we have on the environment. A major component of this approach is using native plants, but we also want to be using our resources wisely and minimize waste. So let's compare conventional container gardening with a more eco-friendly approach. Traditionally, we've tended to focus only on what our containers look like with little to no regard for wildlife. We've relied primarily on non-native and mostly annual plants, which we discard after their blooms fade. We've used synthetic fertilizers, and we've often used pesticides to make sure that our plants don't show any signs of insect activity. In contrast, when we have a more eco-friendly approach, we want our containers to not only look good, we want them to do good. So we're really going to prioritize the wildlife value of the plants we choose. We're going to rely mostly on native plants, mostly on perennials. We want to reuse and recycle plants. We want to use natural fertilizers like compost, and we want to avoid pesticides. We want to learn to tolerate and maybe even celebrate insect activity. So why are native plants so important when we think about eco-friendly gardening? The simple answer is insects. Native plants are necessary for insect survival. 90% of leaf-feeding insects, many of them caterpillars, are what we call insect specialists. They can eat only one native plant or one family of native plants, and that's because they co-evolved with them over thousands and thousands of years and developed these relationships. These plants are called their host plants, and that's a term many of us know. But why should we care? Why should we even care about insects? Where I grew up, insects were yucky and we just squashed them. But why should we care about them? They provide essential services that we really can't live without. So I want to mention a couple of the big ones. Insects are the primary drivers of our ecosystems. Plant-eating insects transfer energy from plants to other animals, and if we took away insects from our food webs, they would collapse. You all may be familiar with Doug Tallamy. His research has shown that 96% of terrestrial birds feed insects, mostly caterpillars, to their young. So even those birds that as adults later rely on seeds and fruits, they need caterpillars when it's time to feed their babies. And remember, those caterpillars, mostly feeding insects, are specialists and they must have specific native host plants to survive. We all love to see birds and we want them to come to our yard, but if we want to see a greater number and variety of birds, we need more than bird feeders. We need to be sure we have plenty of native plants so that we can grow lots of caterpillars and other insects. The second essential service I want to mention is pollination. Insects pollinate 85% of flowering plants and 2/3 of the world's crops. We have over 3,600 native bee species in North America, and of those, 20 to 45% are pollen specialists. So just like with our leaf-eating specialists, they have specific native plants that they need in order to complete their life cycles. They rely on native plants. So insects are important, and we can't live without them, right? But why do they need our help? Well, unfortunately, 40% of all insects are in decline. Scientists refer to this as the insect apocalypse. A third are endangered. The rate of insect decline is 8 times faster than that of mammals, birds, and reptiles. And I think this has really flown under our radar because they're not as charismatic, say, as the polar bear or the tiger. And this decline is primarily due to habitat loss and fragmentation. But the good news is when we provide eco-friendly gardens, including container gardens, we're offering what we call stepping stone habitats. And these are microhabitats that help insects and other wildlife move between larger areas of habitat. These stepping stones are really vital in urban and suburban areas where native plant resources are absent or fragmented. Let's say a town has a park, and then about a mile away, there's an undeveloped lot or field. And in between, you have apartment buildings, condos, or homes surrounded by non-native plants. Small gardens, such as eco-friendly container gardens on balconies, can help the insects move between the park and the field. This makes it a lot easier for insects to find food, meet a mate, and find somewhere safe to raise their young. It increases genetic diversity and reduces the risk of disease and inbreeding. To be most helpful, our little stepping stone habitats should offer host plants as well as a variety of blooms over as much of the year as possible. As with conventional container gardening, when we're designing our eco-friendly container gardens, we'll want to think about plant height, color, and texture combinations. Our online document covers each of these topics in some detail, and I really hope you'll visit the CLI website to read those. But for now, though, Emily's going to help us learn the important steps for setting up and maintaining eco-friendly container gardens.
Okay, so so I'm going to just cover some of the things you need to think about if you're wanting to include some native plant containers. And a lot of what we're going to talk about will mirror what you do already, maybe if you're putting out containers, for the beautiful flowers, but there will be a couple of differences that I will point out for you. So with any container, you want to think about what the material is of the container and then also the size. Those are two really important considerations when you're picking a container. If you're using non-porous containers, like a lot of the plastics, they tend to hold on to the moisture longer. They won't dry out as quickly as something like terracotta or unglazed ceramic. So in that instance, if you're using those terracotta pots, you may end up needing to water more frequently. The most important thing I would say is drainage. You want to make sure that the water that comes into your pot can drain out the bottom so your plants aren't sitting in soggy soil, because that is probably the biggest issue that we see with containerized plants. Now, when you buy a container or you reuse a container, a lot of times they have holes in the bottom already, but if they're really tiny little holes, you might want to go in and drill some larger holes in the bottom to help improve drainage. When you're thinking about container size, think about those plants made up to double in size or even bigger over the growing season. And so whatever size container you pick needs to be large enough to accommodate. And in our document, we kind of categorized size as a small container up to that 3-gallon size. And then a medium would be, 3 to 7. And then something above 7, which is like those larger containers with the trees, we're going to call a large container. So thinking about matching the mature size of your plants, especially if you plant more than one plant, with the size of your container is going to be very important. When we're filling our containers, we don't just want to dig out some soil from your yard, and we don't want to use a bagged material that's labeled a garden soil or even a topsoil. Those are going to be too heavy for a container. So we want to make sure we're filling our containers with some type of media that has plenty of pore space for water and air. It's going to hold on to moisture, but also drain well. So most of that is going to be labeled as a potting mix if you're buying a bagged material. But something to consider, since this is, trying to be more eco-friendly in this process, is researching the materials that are in these mixes. Because there are things like peat moss, for example, is very commonly found in bagged mixes and is arguably not the most sustainable material. So do your research and find what works for you. There's not a perfect solution, but maybe you can find something that has a lesser impact on the environment. If you're growing in really large containers, you can also add in some soil conditioner, which is often a chopped up pine bark or something that will give you some better aeration in your containers. Maintenance. So in some ways, our native plant containers are going to be a little lower maintenance than maybe your typical annual plants that require lots of fertilizer, lots of water, lots of pinching. But the main thing here is you want to make sure your containers are getting sufficient sunlight. So find a place where they're going to get as much sun as they need, or if they're shade plants, that they're not going to get too much sun. Make sure your container is somewhere where you can easily water it, because again, containers will dry out a little faster than plants in the ground. And your watering is going to vary on the size of your container. So a larger container won't need as much watering, the material, and then the requirements of your plants. Many native plants are very drought tolerant once they're established. You can tell if your container needs water. If you stick your finger in there and it's dry below an inch, then it might be a good time to give it a good watering. As for fertilizer, in traditional containers, like Carol said, we often use a lot of fertilizer to keep them blooming all season long. Many native plants are adapted to very low soil nutrients, so we don't want to over-fertilize. And if you are going to add some fertilizer in, maybe when you change out your container, you can look for a naturally derived fertilizer and apply it as needed. Something else to consider is, we're going to loosely call this tidying up, but the goal here is for your containers to look beautiful, and they can. They may not be as flashy year-round as some of these non-native annuals, but part of the beauty of our native plant containers is their function. They're providing benefits to wildlife and insects that other plants may not provide. So keeping that in mind, that we're doing this for more than just aesthetics. After your perennials have bloomed, as we move into the fall and winter, a lot of times we're tempted to go ahead and just chop everything out and clean it up. But with native plants, we want to keep those perennial stems, and we want to cut them back 8 to 24 inches. This time of year is a good time to start doing that, but we want to leave those cut stems because a lot of native insects will nest in those stems, and so it's essential for their life cycle. And then those will decay on their own. If you put grasses in your containers, you can cut those back to about 6 inches. Again, this is a good time of year to start doing that. When your plants outgrow the container, which is always a good possibility, you can always plant those out in the ground if you have a place. A lot of plants, you can prune the roots, which is just reducing the size of the root ball by about 1/3. And then that kind of helps them not take as much space. Make sure you research that those plants can handle that type of pruning. Or you can dig them up and give them to your friends. And then troubleshooting. So if you see your plants getting eaten by insects, a lot of times initially we think, oh gosh, what's happening? I need to do something. I need to spray something. that's not the goal here, because a lot of times if you do see that happening, especially with native plants, then that's actually a good thing, because our goal is to feed our local insects and wildlife. So like Carol said, if you see something nibbling your plants, it might actually be a cause for excitement. So you can see in the bottom pictures, a Gulf fritillary butterfly caterpillar is chomping on the passion flower vine leaves, but that's going to grow into a beautiful butterfly. So we want that to be happening. And then the other picture shows little holes out of the leaves, and those are certain types of bees called leaf cutting bees. And they chew off the leaves and they use it for their nesting materials. So those are just some examples of what we actually would like to see. And if you ever have any concerns or questions, definitely reach out to your local Cooperative Extension office, and they will be happy to help. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, and she's going to get to talk about all of the beautiful plants that you can incorporate into your containers.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. And I noticed a few people asked in the chat about the document, and Gloria did put a link to that document in the chat. So anyone that wants to, who has two screens and wants to look at both, feel free to do that. So in this section, we're going to be talking about the plant tables that we created to assist gardeners in making plant choices for their containers. So to do that, we're first going to cover expectations and definitions, then give an overview of how to use the plant selection tables, and briefly discuss the featured plant families and their wildlife benefits. We'll then cover some examples of species from the tables and how to mix and match those species for multi-season interest. Lastly, we're going to close with some real-life examples. So our first definition is actually a quick review. Sustainable gardening refers to a more ecologically friendly way of gardening, and it could be the topic of an entire presentation. As Carol pointed out, though, a simple way to think about what makes sustainable gardening different than conventional gardening, whether it's in a container or in the ground, is considering wildlife value and resource conservation in addition to the aesthetics when making your plant choices and management decisions. So we're not taking aesthetics out of the picture completely, we're just adding in other things. So what makes sustainable container gardening its own topic separate from in the ground sustainable gardening? The main difference are that some plants, whether native or otherwise, are much better suited to container culture than others. As an example, some plants that may be very drought tolerant in the ground don't thrive with the stress of root confinement. In addition, space constraints can also make it more difficult to produce the year-round beauty that's often expected from our display containers. So in many ways, container gardening comes with its own set of challenges, and wise plant selection can go a long way to creating successful containers. With this in mind, we created 6 tables featuring plants that are both well-suited to container culture and offer wildlife value. We also tried to consider availability. So while not all the species featured are widely commercially available, most can be found at garden centers. Remember that these tables aren't exhaustive, but do offer a starting point for more sustainable container gardening. Okay, so one way to make better informed plant choices is to understand the life cycle of the plant in question. This knowledge can go a long way towards helping you make choices that will extend the life of your containers and save you money. The plant species in the tables are divided into 4 categories. The first are temperate perennials, which are usually just referred to as perennials. Most bloom during a specific season and may be long-lived or short-lived. Short-lived temperate perennials tend to have a longer bloom season and benefit from deadheading to extend flowering period or encourage reblooming. A good example is blanket flower, pictured here on the left with the bumblebee visitor. Most short-lived temperate perennials are ideal candidates for containers as long as there's enough labor available to stay on top of the deadheading. Longer-lived perennials tend to have a shorter bloom time, so aren't always a great fit for containers. However, longer-lived perennial species whose foliage or seed heads have high aesthetic appeal, such as the blue stars pictured here, are great container candidates, though they will usually need to be planted in ground or root pruned after a couple of seasons. All temperate perennials have a season of dormancy where the below ground structures are alive, but above ground growth is either limited or absent. Most, but not all, of the native plants featured in our tables are temperate perennials. Okay, so the next category is tropical perennials, which are treated as annuals and often are even referred to as annuals because they're not winter hardy, so they appear to die in the fall when the temperatures drop below freezing. However, most tropical perennials will bloom as long as the weather is warm enough and can often tolerate root restriction. So great for mixing with temperate perennials to extend the bloom time of your containers. Tropical perennials, such as the salvia pictured here with the hummingbird visitor, can be overwintered in a cold frame or protected area for use again the next year. As the name implies, they're native to tropical areas, so not native to the Southeast or Mid-Atlantic. However, those listed in the tables provide nectar, and some provide other wildlife benefits depending on the species. The next are annuals, which are plants that complete their life cycle in one season. Once they produce seed, their life cycles are complete and they'll die. So, like the short-lived perennials, annuals benefit from deadheading to extend their life. Basil, pictured here with a native bee visitor, is a great example of an annual. Biennials are similar to annuals, except that they're longer lived since they grow vegetatively one season, then bloom the following season or year. Parsley, pictured here with the black swallowtail caterpillar, is a good example of a biennial. Like annuals, they will have completed their life cycle after blooming and forming seed, so they'll only appear again the following season if they're allowed to reseed. So our goal with this document is to really set you up for success, which means understanding what successful container gardening really looks like. Keep in mind that the aesthetic expectations created by gardening magazines and some social media sites are kind of unrealistic and don't help us set attainable goals. Pictures like these are created by taking multiple plants that are at their peak and putting them all into a pot together to get a picture or catch your eye for sale. These pictures only have to look good for the amount of time the picture is taken, or if in real life, for you to purchase the container, and don't take into account the amount of space needed for the plants or the longevity of the plants in the container. I would argue that this is more plant decorating and not actual gardening. Great if you're decorating for an event, but not as relevant for a container that needs to look good all season, especially considering the length of our growing season in the Southeast. I encourage everyone to set their own expectations for their containers and not compare your creations to pictures like these. Comparing real life gardening to these would be like comparing yourself to the airbrushed models on the cover of Vogue. It's just not totally real. The nurture and husbandry that are an important part of this type of gardening are not considered, nor is wildlife value or resource use. What we're advocating for is a more holistic approach that involves more understanding of your plants as living beings and not just decoration objects. So with that said, it's now time to look at the tables. Keep in mind that everything I'm covering here is included in the introduction of the document, available online for free, so there's no need to remember it all. Pictured here is an example of one of the tables, and I'll walk you through how to use it. We use two parameters for categorizing each of the tables: sun exposure, so sun or shade, and container size, small, medium, or large, as Emily mentioned earlier, which are found at the top of each table. Keep in mind that while medium and large plants are not recommended for smaller containers, small plants could be used for creating combinations in larger containers. Both native and non-native plants that are especially container friendly and have wildlife value were selected. Native selections will appear in bold capital letters to distinguish them from non-native plants. Note that plants were chosen for the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic, zones 7 and 8, but the tables could be adapted to be used elsewhere. Though non-native plants are included to help prolong bloom times and increase options, no plants that are considered invasive in these regions were chosen, and we encourage gardeners to choose native plants wherever possible. Common and scientific names are given for most plants to help alleviate confusion, because some plants have multiple common names, and sometimes the same common name is used for multiple species. Flower color and bloom times are pretty straightforward, though keep in mind that these times are for zone 7 and 8, so might need adjusting if you're in another region. The notes section is a little more nuanced, so I'm going to go over the information included. The first is life cycle, which, as we've already discussed, can be very useful for helping you make plant choices. Unless noted, you can assume that a plant is a temperate perennial. An example in this table is moss phlox. Since it is a temperate perennial, you'll notice that life cycle is not noted in the box. In contrast, pink stonecrop is listed as an annual, parsley a biennial, and scarlet sage a tropical perennial, listed here as tropical for brevity. Habit and other aesthetic interests are also noted for some species. For instance, in addition to spring flowers, moss phlox provides greenery in the winter, which can be useful for planting multi-season containers. As it was impossible to include comprehensive wildlife values in this amount of space, we focused on the more easily observable wildlife values. A little clarification about these. Unless noted, such as with ferns, assume all plants chosen provide nectar when in bloom, so this will not be listed due to space constraints. However, if a flower size or shape is especially good at attracting a specific animal, such as a hummingbird, that may be noted. As we already mentioned, many species of native wildlife depend on particular plants to complete their life cycle, and these plants are referred to as host plants. Our example here is the black swallowtail butterfly, a host-specific insect whose caterpillar is pictured here and uses parsley as a host plant. In addition to caterpillar host plants, some plants are also hosts for pollen specialist bees, so keep an eye out for that notation also. The last notation is for plant family. Though we don't encounter botany much in our everyday lives, knowing what family or plant is in can provide useful information as to its wildlife benefits. Learning more about the benefits of a particular family is much easier than memorizing benefits for thousands of individual species. For example, the aforementioned black swallowtail caterpillar only feeds on plants in the carrot family, including parsley and fennel, pictured here. In the tables, we consolidated the two plant families that appeared the most, which are the aster and mint families, and provided a list of their wildlife benefits in the introduction to the document available online. An example here is scarlet sage, which is in the mint family. Here, only the families noted, and gardeners can refer to the introduction of the document for more details on wildlife value. For plants in other families, wildlife information is given individually for the plant, as it is here for parsley and wild petunia. So this leads us to plant families. The first featured is the aster family. Aster family species have one of the most recognizable flower shapes out there. Probably the shape you drew as a kid when you drew a flower, a classic sunflower or zinnia shape that's illustrated here with echinacea, daisy, and aster, each with a native bee, butterfly, or flower visitor. Note that sometimes smaller flower clusters on asters can be harder to distinguish with the naked eye, such as with the goldenrods featured in the far left pictures, or bone sets, the white flower shown in the center. However, closer inspection reveals lots of tiny aster flowers. Asters are what are considered a keystone species because of the number of wildlife benefits they offer and their importance to ecosystem functioning. There are both native asters, pictured here, and non-native aster species. One important thing to consider when choosing an aster is that it's really best to avoid those that have been modified to be double or pom-pom, as these often block the access to pollen or nectar. Echinaceas or coneflowers and mums are two examples of aster family species that are often modified to be double and whose extra petals can cover up the resources that pollinators need. Luckily, there are over 32,000 aster family species worldwide, so you should be able to find a species that will work for you, the native choice most often being the better option if possible. The second featured family is the mint family. Mint family species always have square stems and flowers that are bilateral, meaning you can cut them in half from top to bottom and the flower halves will be mirror images of each other. They usually have pungent leaves and include many of our culinary Mediterranean herbs such as lavender, mint, thyme, and oregano, as well as native species. The mint family species attract a wide variety of pollinators depending on the size of the plant. Native bee balms are favorites of hummingbirds and large bees, such as this American bumblebee on the left and silver-spotted skipper butterfly in the top middle. Depending on the species, they can attract both our large charismatic butterflies, such as the North Carolina state insect, the eastern tiger swallowtail shown on right, and also smaller native insects, such as leafcutter bees, seen here on the basil flowers in the middle picture, and tiny but beautiful hair streak butterflies featured in the bottom right on a mountain mint. Mountain mints are another native species that are considered pollinator powerhouses. Mint and aster species are also host to caterpillars, such as this decorator caterpillar, a kid favorite that uses the petals from the plant to disguise itself, as pictured in the top right. As a bonus, the mint family is not usually browsed by deer or rabbits, which is especially useful for those of us gardeners who deal with a lot of mammal herbivore browsing. The carrot family is one that is not featured in the table, but since I mentioned it in the introductory slides, I just wanted to show a few plants from the carrot family. So that's the family that includes parsley, a non-native herb, and also lots of native plants such as golden Alexander and button orango and marsh orango pictured here. They're the host, like I mentioned, for black swallowtails, and also provide lots of pollen and nectar for a number of different size pollinators. Okay, on to the tables. These next slides feature some examples from the tables to illustrate some of the plants that were selected. I won't spend too much time on these, but hope they'll illustrate there are many beautiful plants to choose from that can also provide wildlife value. I won't be mentioning all the plants pictured, but instead we'll highlight some favorites. We'll start with small containers for sun. Small containers are often the most challenging for me due to the root restriction. Keep in mind that the species featured in this table could also be mixed and matched in larger containers. Woods blue aster, shown here with a metallic bee and a bumblebee, is one of my favorites for containers due to its long bloom time for a temperate perennial and its ability to deal with root restriction. Dwarf basils are great for a porch container as they provide culinary use in the kitchen and pollinator resources, as illustrated here by a different species of metallic bee. Parsley is a great hardy biennial that can be planted in the fall for kitchen use in the winter. In the spring, the leaves will be eaten by the black swallowtail caterpillars and the flowers visited by a wide variety of pollinators. Moving on to medium containers for sun, milkweed is pictured here with two pollinators. A southern plains bumblebee, currently being proposed for endangered species protection, and a small native bee. Milkweed also acts as a host plant for monarch butterfly caterpillars, another insect currently proposed for endangered species protection, and pictured above on the aromatic aster, a great nectar plant. Orange milkweed is best paired with another species that can take over its space, as its showiness often declines in the midsummer heat. Little bluestem is a great choice for this, and is also a host plant for several skipper butterflies. If you're on the Crystal Coast, its cousin, the seaside little bluestem, is a host plant for the endangered crystal skipper. As a side note, it was an accident that all the endangered species in the presentation ended up on this slide, but it does illustrate Carol's point that insects are facing many challenges, and we're in a good position to provide them with more of the resources that they need. The last sun table is for large containers, which provide the space for using many species and getting creative. Keep in mind that large containers require lots more planting medium and are a good place to try out some of the sustainable peat moss alternatives that Emily mentioned earlier. If you're not in the mood to mix and match, but instead want to go for the bold one plant only look, the coral honeysuckle is a great, easy to find, multi-season interest plant that attracts hummingbirds and other pollinators. It's also a host plant for hummingbird moths, a day-flying, flower-visiting moth that is fascinating to watch. Okay, so this slide illustrates an example of using the sun tables to create a multi-season, mostly native container planting. Using the chart and/or your own knowledge, try selecting a plant from each of the seasonal categories, spring, summer, and fall, then selecting a longer blooming or multi-season interest plant to add the container to create a long-lasting display. For this pastel-themed container, the temperate native perennials beard tongue, whorled milkweed, and woods blue aster are paired with Mexican heather, a long-blooming tropical kufia. You might prefer a more colorful container and could go with bright yellow baptisia, orange milkweed, and bat-faced kufia in place of the pastels. You can bring your own creativity to the table, or if you prefer, example combinations are available in the online document as a starting point. These pictures illustrate a very large container display in multiple seasons. While most people won't have containers this size at home, the concepts are also helpful for smaller displays. While some plants are changed out seasonally, there's only a need for replacement of plants and some potting media 2 times a year, late May and early November for us in the Outer Banks. In November, hardy annuals and biennials, such as pansies and parsley, are paired with early season temperate perennials, such as baptisia, and evergreen mint family species that bloom in the spring. When the temperatures get too hot for the winter annuals and biennials, usually by late May, they're replaced with a mixture of tropical perennials and summer and fall blooming temperate perennials, with an occasional summer annual to round out the display. Temperate perennials are planted out in gardens after spending a year or so in the container. Now it's time to switch gears and look at some examples from the shade-loving tables, starting with species for small containers. Shade containers can be just as lovely as sun containers and also provide just as much wildlife value. The woodland geranium blooms very early in the spring when it's really appreciated and is a host plant for the pollen specialist native bees. Antenaria is one of my favorites because its semi-evergreen, ground-hugging foliage provides similar fuzziness to lamb's ear and is a host plant for the American lady butterfly. Here you can see one laying eggs on the foliage. The leaves will disappear briefly while the caterpillars are growing up, but they'll grow back quickly and you'll be rewarded with adult butterflies. There are many ferns which are great shade plant additions for medium-sized containers. Though they don't provide nectar, they are host plant to several caterpillars and pair wonderfully with woodland flowering temperate perennials such as spring blooming columbine, summer blooming whitewood aster, and fall blooming elephant foot, or they can be featured on their own. Large shaded containers provide an opportunity for featuring smaller statured shrubs, especially if you have a yard or another place they can be planted when they outgrow your container. Clethra and native hydrangea are examples of species that can be purchased at lower price for a smaller plant and can be enjoyed while growing out in a container for planting in your yard the following year. Because many small shrubs are understory plants, there are lots of good native shrub species to choose from in addition to the larger shade-loving perennials like the wreath goldenrod or sweet Joe Pye pictured here. Using the same approaches with the shade tables, we can select one plant from each season and also have the option of adding ferns or other evergreens such as sedges to extend seasonal interest. In the summer, long blooming annuals such as wishbone flower or impatiens can add a pop of color between bloom times of temperate perennials. Here we've chosen spring blooming foam flower, which provides both flowers and evergreen foliage. As its flowers will fade, summer blooming Culver's root and fall blooming whitewood aster take turns attracting the pollinators. As you can see on the Culver's root, you can support pollinators with shade-loving plants, despite the popular belief that you must have full sun to have a pollinator garden. And here are some examples of some shade-loving containers. As you can see, foliage contrast can also be a focal point of these containers, as is the case on the far left, where ferns, ginger, antenaria, and coral bells create a lovely show even after the coral bells are done blooming. Aesthetics and plant choices could be the focus of an entire presentation, so consider these just an introduction and enjoy using your containers to showcase your own creativity. With that in mind, I'll pass it along to Monica to talk about her experience creating containers with the Beaufort Garden Club.
Hi, thank you, Rachel. Yes, I belong to the Beaufort Garden Club, and I'm part of a committee called the Beautification Committee, also known as the Pretty Ladies. There's about 60 of us on there, and we maintain the gardens and the planters for the town for about pretty much all year. We work once a week, and it's kind of fun. We do have challenges in Beaufort, and the main thing that we have is salt spray year-round. We have wind, and sometimes we have lots of wind and gales. We have very dry summers and pretty much wet and cold winters. And we were fortunate enough to get some really large planters. As you can see in the picture, those are actually propane tanks. They came from a metal recycler down the road. and the town allowed us to use them in one of our future gardens. The nice thing is that they're large, and we can plant a lot of different plants in there, but we can also have labels. And labels are kind of important when you have a lot of locals and tourists. And we use these zinc labels, which hold up really well to the salt. And we were lucky enough to score these lovely labels from CLI, and they have the QR codes. And what I've noticed about these labels is that they're not always in the same place in the planters, which means people are taking them out, photographing them, using the QR codes, and reading about the plants, which is kind of cool. We had a beautiful planter with this gaillardia. It was gorgeous. It was called, I think, Ruby Tubes. It billowed, and you can see that there's a young high school person there, and she's getting her senior pictures, and she was really enjoying that planter, but we lost that plant to a pretty good windstorm during the summer. That brings me up to the next slide. If we can go to the next slide, please, Gloria, because thank you. That I tend to, I'm a little bit picky because we have visitors. I like to actually change the plants out so they look really good. And we do actually we can recycle the plants into other gardens, which is kind of nice. But I've had a little bit more of a challenge, is like running out to Lowe's or to the garden center finding native plants. So this year I'm getting a little bit more proactive, and I'll be ordering them from local native plant nurseries a little bit further away. However, I do like to keep things interesting. And so for the winter, I actually added some brassicas this year. And so in the smaller planter, we have brassicas. There's also a little blueberry shrub, which kind of held up for the winter. It's called Rose's Blush. It's kind of a more of a little inland type of a blueberry. We can find those in our Patsy's Pond. I don't know if you've ever traveled over there. It's basically a nice pine forest, and you can see them in there. But what I've also added was a little magnolia and a longleaf pine to add some interest. And hopefully we can keep those in for maybe 2 to 3 years before they get too large and I'll have to replace them. But I'm going to try and add a few more annuals this year to keep color year round. That's been probably the biggest challenge, is to keep everything looking really fresh for mainly our visitors. If it was my home, I wouldn't be that picky. Anyway, thank you. It's been a pleasure being here.
Gloria, you're still muted.
Okay, good. I'm back, I think. Thank you, Monica, for coming and talking to us about your experiences there with using these native plants. I know that you said that you'd mentioned that you weren't quite sure about it, but you have since changed your mind since you started doing this. And
Well, I see. It's really important to have the native plants. I didn't start out that way when I joined the garden club, but then I realized everything pretty much that I was buying was pretty much alien, and how important it is to have native plants for your birds and caterpillars and insects.
yeah, I think it's you know, a lot of it is a learning process for so many of us, and I think that your experience is helpful, and I thank you again for coming and talking with us, and being experiential. And I would also like to thank the rest of the speakers for coming and spending their time on creating the document as well as pulling together this presentation. It takes a lot of work to do this. If you've ever pulled anything together, finding images and getting your timing and your words right. So I know I am pretty excited. I mean, I learn something new every time I talk to you ladies. And I am now really excited and ready for spring to come along, and so I can get my containers planted with a few of these plants that we've learned about today. And I'm hoping others also are inspired. I think they probably are. And I wanted to identify, let everybody know about the Southeast. If I can get my,
Colony.
there we go. About the Great Southeast Pollinator Census that is coming up this August. If you have containers and you have insects, you have native plants, you can participate in this census. The North Carolina Cooperative Extension is is leading up the coordination in North Carolina, and you can do this on your own, or you can do it with your local extension office. I will put in the chat the link to find out more about them, and we do encourage you to participate either alone or with others. And a number of people have asked about where they can buy native plants. That is a challenge, and I will tell you that the Coastal Landscapes Initiative is also doing some other work to try to increase the availability of native plants. We may actually be participating in an event this summer sponsored by the North Carolina Landscape Association to talk about native plants and increasing and challenges and opportunities to grow them. So here are a couple of upcoming plant sales and for the spring in coastal North Carolina. And there's also one huge one that's in the fall that you can plan for now. There are also two really good websites. The Coastal Landscapes Initiative, we have a section, we have a list of nurseries where you can buy that some nurseries that carry native plants. And then North Carolina Native Plant Society also has a terrific webpage of native plant growers. And finally, I wanted to provide you the contact information for the speakers that we had today. Feel free, they've agreed, you feel free to reach out to them and ask them any questions or maybe even to speak locally. So with that, I am going to thank you all for attending today and for your interest and for planting the natives. And I'm going to kick it over to Christy as she's going to direct our questions.
Yeah, the presentations were wonderful. Thank you. We have several questions in our Q&A that came up, and I'm going to start with the ones that were asked by multiple folks just to try and get those out of the way before people drop off. And there were a lot of questions about the materials that go into containers. And for example, can you use professional mix because it's lighter? What ingredients do we want or not want? What is a soil conditioner? Can you use large pine cones in the bottom of large containers to save space and soil? So I'm going to turn it over to Emily to answer those questions.
Sure. Yeah. So a professional mix or a pro mix is basically it's a bagged potting mix. It's what a lot of the nurseries use when they're potting up their plants for sale. So it's just a version of that. And I think for a long time the standard main ingredient in a lot of these mixes is peat moss, is peat. And it's actually mined from peat bogs. A lot of ours comes from Canada, but it takes a very, very long time to form. And so as it's mined, it takes a long time for it to reform. So it's anyway, so it's not necessarily the most sustainable product that we can use, but it's very effective at holding moisture and draining well, which is why we use it. And there's a lot of it, it's easy to access. So a lot of the newer products or, what we might say are a little bit more sustainable, we're seeing a lot more wood-based products. So, if they're grinding up trees, it's a byproduct that can be used, and that can kind of have a similar function in the mix. You might also see coconut coir as a main ingredient, which it's a byproduct from coconut husks that can be found, which obviously is getting shipped across the world. So it's not, in that sense, maybe not as sustainable. So that's why I wanted to say that there's no silver bullet that's going to solve our problems with container mixes. And then a lot of the perlite and other minerals that we use in our potting mixes are also mined. So anyway, there's not an easy solution, but do your best to find maybe locally sourced ingredients, for example. Soil conditioner is often a ground up pine bark. So it's larger pieces of pine bark that you can incorporate in with your potting mix. And that just kind of helps with aeration. I would caution putting lots of items at the bottom of your pots to save space, but something like that soil conditioner would be a good option because it will still allow for good drainage.
Okay, thank you. And then just related, if a container's not draining quickly, are there ways to prevent root rot?
Mm.
I would look at your soil mix. What, is it, because there are some that are going to be heavier than others. If there's too much compost, sometimes it can stay a little wet, or not enough, materials that are helping increase that aeration. So looking at your mix, I would start with, and I would also look at your container, the hole size in the bottom of your container. And making sure that they're getting enough sun, so that they're drying out as they're taking in that water. So those are a couple things I would look at.
Thank you. Another topic that we had a lot of questions about were about specific plants. And I was gonna mention that on the website that has been shared, the CLI website, there are resources for reading about specific plants. There's the Native Plants Guide. The North Carolina Cooperative Extension has a database. There's a link to that database, so you can look up specific plants to get information about those plants. We shared where you can find native plants. Gloria mentioned that was also on our website. A couple other specific questions we have are we allowed to plant endangered plants? And I feel like I could answer part of that. Like if you can't go out into a park and pull up a plant and replant it. Right? I would imagine if you can find it in a store, you can buy it and plant it, but I don't know if there's more to that question or not. But any thoughts about endangered plants?
I guess it's not a great answer, but it kind of depends on the species. So some plants and what state you're in. So it's a little more nuanced, but if you're buying it from a reputable nursery, like I'm trying to think, a good example would be like Tennessee coneflower, is one that is available commercially that's considered endangered. Like Christy said, you're not allowed to just go dig it out of the wild, but if you buy it from a reputable grower, then that is something you plant. But not all endangered plants are going to be available commercially. In fact, a lot of them won't. So the short answer is it kind of depends. So if there's a specific plant you're interested in, I could probably answer that more easily.
And can I add just something real quick? It's Carol here. The plants are beautiful where they are, and a lot of the plants, especially those that are endangered, they rely on very specific conditions in order to survive. So if you see, oh, a beautiful pink lady slipper, and you dig it up and you take it home, I promise you it's not going to survive. It needs the soil that it's in. Some of our native plants actually have like relationships so that they only grow with another plant. That's very specific. So they're beautiful. Leave them where they are. If you find them from a reputable nursery, I would talk about how can I help this plant thrive in my home. But please, please, please don't dig things up in the wild and bring them home.
Yeah, and I'd say like the only exception might be is if there's a planned plant rescue from like the Native Plant Society, right, Carol? Like sometimes.
Yes, correct.
That.
The Native Plant Society, if we are able to work out an arrangement with the developer, you will see across the state that we'll do plant rescues where we'll go to the site before development. And if that's the case, then we try to rescue everything we can.
Great, thank you. So I'm gonna get to some more specific questions that we had, because we do have till 1:15, correct? Gloria, is that? Yes, I see a thumbs up. Okay. So just so we can get to some of these more nuanced questions, when can we plant containers?
I can take that, and then if somebody wants to chime in. So it kind of depends on what you're going to plant. If you're in the Southeast, year round, I've always got something in my containers. So it's just matching the season to the container. So we're lucky. I don't know, my friends in Vermont always say, how do you garden year round? And I think, how do you not garden year round? So I guess you could see it as lucky or unlucky. But yeah, we can, we have a really long growing season. There's lots of hardy plants that look good all winter, both native and non-native. So in the document, it does have the season and hardiness listed. So you can figure out when you want to plant things. For me, I usually do most of my changing out in the end of May, right before it gets really hot for summer plants. And then because we're on the coast here, we have a really late fall. So I can usually get my summer planters to stay looking good till November. And then I switch out for the hardy plants. So, the time of year you do it will be different for you. And sometimes in smaller containers, you're going to have to switch them out more often. But yeah, short answer is all year. So if anyone wants to add to that.
You had a good answer there. Okay, there's another question about cutting back, like when you do cut back stems, and you want to leave them for nesting insects, can you leave them in the container or should you move them to a pile somewhere else?
So ideally, you'll just leave the cut stem attached to the plant, because that's what happens in nature. What can happen if they're placed on their side or they fall down, they can get soggy and moldy and kind of decay faster. So if you can just leave them, they might blow over in the wind or something, but the ones that stay put will be a good resource for the pollinators.
Great, thank you. There's a question about mulch. That is not, what is a good mulch that is not just dyed pallet wood? And my understanding is that fresh chips are fine. Triple shredded hardwood is fine, but yeah, somebody else want to take that, Rachel or Emily?
I can start. I don't generally mulch my containers because the plants are usually close enough together that they're shading the soil, so you're not really getting weeds, and you're not, there's not as much issue of, say, like if you're planning like a landscaping at, say, a bank or somewhere where you're going to have more space exposed. In areas where I often will just use a really thin layer of compost and then let that break down if the point is to keep moisture in and then protect against weeds seeding in, and then that way as it breaks down it's also fertilizing the plants. But yeah, in containers I don't really use mulch, or another thing is just like shredded leaves from your yard. Like they're such small areas, like that makes a nice sort of like keeping the soil a little cooler, keeping in the moisture, but not with the wood chips and things. They're going to have so much carbon that you don't really want those breaking down in your planters and tying up nitrogen. So
just from my experience, I really like to use the soil conditioner, especially if your plants are young in the container and you want to kind of keep the roots shaded or whatever. The pine fines or the soil conditioner, you can put just a really light layer, and it also just makes your container look a little nicer when your plants are young.
And I guess I was answering thinking of the yard.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mulching a container might not be needed. So
Yes.
then, oh, go ahead.
I want to just chime in on the topic of mulch, not for containers, but just in general, just mulch. I encourage people to try to use like living mulch, plants, ground cover, as opposed to other kinds of mulch that you have to purchase. I have found, I know what's on the coast, but I live in the Piedmont. often find two things. One is that it can actually prevent water from getting down into the soil. It can mat up and be just a big problem. And the other thing is if you're growing plants and native plants that you want to seed out and germinate, it's mulch is good for preventing germination. So it prevents plants that you want to germinate from. I didn't realize why some of my plants weren't spreading. It's because I had 3 inches of mulch out there. So I just encourage you to think about that. Thanks for letting me.
Yeah, great. Okay, back to couple specific questions. On the coast, do we mix any of the native sand or maritime forest soil in with our pots? Any thoughts on that, Rachel or Emily or Carol?
I mean, in general, unless you're in a really, really large container, I wouldn't add any native soil or mineral soil, which is why we usually go for something that's designed for pots, like a potting mix, just because of the drainage and aeration that we need. Because the mineral soil, even though it's sandy, can get pretty heavy in a container. Rachel might have some more thoughts about that. I don't know.
I don't really have anything to add. I mean, yeah, I don't usually add to a display container any native soil. This is a little bit off topic, but sort of a question that Christy had mentioned earlier. As far as adding things to the bottom of the container, the one thing I've done to sort of bulk up containers, I'm assuming that's where the question's coming from. If you have really large containers, like, I don't know if everyone remembers, but there was a slide with some really large containers. I actually lined maybe the first, I want to say 2 feet or more with, when I cut my panicum grasses back in the spring, I put like the first 2 to 3 feet just grass before I put any soil, and just some like stems from the previous year, things that were going to break down, but so that I didn't have to use so much potting soil. And then tried some of the new like peat moss alternatives to mix in with the soil I use. So there are ways you can bulk up that garden potting soil, because it is really expensive, and it probably will only get more expensive. But yeah, usually you want to shy away, and also just, you don't know what kind of pathogens might be in your soil, which in the ground would be okay for plants, but in a pot might get kind of concentrated. So,
And then as far as materials to go in the pots, there was a question about coir. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. COIR, coir.
Yeah, the coconut coir is essentially an alternative to peat. And it's a byproduct of coconut husks. So, it's something that is a byproduct. So they're not, it's a very renewable resource that way. And it has it's got a good texture that's very similar to peat. And they just need to make sure it's been rinsed thoroughly to get any excess salts off of it. But, this can go in many directions, but if we're bringing this stuff in from Indonesia or other countries, then that's a big undertaking. If we're trying to think about the most sustainable ingredients, that's just something to keep in mind. But it is definitely a good alternative to peat-based products.
Right. There was also a question about planting in potting bags as opposed to pots. Anyone familiar with that?
sorry, Emily, I think you've gotten all the questions. I'll try to help.
No, y'all share the love.
I have used them before. I'd say they're kind of comparable. If we think back to Emily's slides about ceramic versus plastic, they're a little bit more like the ceramic because they are really porous. I will say it's really nice because they often have handles. So if you're planting large planters, you can lift them. Whereas sometimes a large pot, I've definitely hurt my back just with the awkwardness of trying to lift a large pot. So that's a bonus. And they can also be, you can lift them and sort of put them inside a prettier container and then, take them out. So they seem to work well, but they do have, the porosity means that they're going to dry out a little faster usually has been my experience.
Should you change your potting soil yearly?
Not necessarily. I mean, you can usually get, 2 or 3 seasons if you start with a good quality. You may find that as it kind of breaks down and settles, it will get a little heavy and the drainage won't be as good. So, every couple of seasons refreshing it or incorporating in some of that soil conditioner to help refresh it can help. Adding in some compost can help refresh the mix.
Yeah, I'll add a quick, since again, Emily seems to have the most popular questions. I usually only change out some of my soil. I mean, obviously depends on the size of the container, because sometimes with your small containers, if like you have a perennial in a small container, once you take it out, the root mass is going to be big enough that there's not going to be any soil left anyway. But if you have a larger container where you can dig the plants out, I usually just take some of it out, and then I can use that. I'll just put it out in my garden or somewhere. It's just going to break down out there. And then the only reason that I would say you would need to change out all of it is if you are noticing you're getting some sort of root disease or other soil-borne disease that's affecting your plants, and you probably wouldn't want to reuse that soil. But if you are able to reuse a good bit of your soil over time, there are a lot of slow release natural fertilizer options now versus the synthetic fertilizers that used to be the only ones available as slow release. So especially if you started out with a soil that had, there are a lot of organic alternatives for garden soils these days, even at Lowe's and box stores. But over time, those are going to get used up by the plants. So you might want to add in, like Emily was saying, some compost or some slow release organic fertilizer.
Thank you. So there is also a question about native plants and what's the significance of using cultivars of native plants as opposed to native plants? Do you have any information about that?
I'll take that one. That's another it depends question. So, the short answer is if you can find a straight species, especially in the ground, it's usually the best choice. However, especially in containers, sometimes a cultivar that's bred to be shorter or not as tall can be good, especially like Monica was talking about if you live in a real windy area where the whole plant's going to fall over if it's too tall. So there are definitely reasons to choose a cultivar, especially in a container. However, the thing you want to consider, and we mentioned this briefly with the asters, is that some cultivars are bred for reasons of reducing height or making it bushier or have more flowers. And some cultivars are bred just for weird novelty flowers. And so sometimes those weird novelty flowers are sterile or have so many petals that the pollinators can't get to the resources in the middle. So short answer, if you can find another plant that's not a cultivar, that's, go for it and it works for you. But, there are definitely times where it's appropriate to use a cultivar. Just make sure that the resources those animals need, such as the nectar and pollen, are still going to be accessible. So if you can't see the middle of an aster flower because there's so many petals, then a bee is not going to be able to get in there either. Or if you're, some of the hydrangeas are bred to have only sterile flowers instead of flowers with pollen, like that's not going to help any of the pollinators either.
Thank you. So we had a question from somebody who is interested in becoming a master gardener, but they could not find where to sign up for that as being current. So I don't know if Emily, you might have any information about master gardeners.
Yeah, so the Extension Master Gardener volunteer program is run through your county extension office. Not every county has a program, so contact your county extension office and see if they have a program. Sometimes if they don't, surrounding counties might take you in. But it is a volunteer program, so you take a training and then you volunteer in your county's program. So I would contact your local county extension office.
I think I'm getting down to the end here. Let me look. There was a recent question, should we rinse the coir liners we buy to use in wire baskets?
I never have, but I think, but you're not that's not your planting mix. So it's, I imagine that they've already been kind of processed accordingly. So I wouldn't worry about that. And most of the potting media that you buy that's marketed as a potting mix and it has that core probably has already been buffered and rinsed. So it's more if you were buying a raw material that you would want to think about that.
Okay.
I did see a question about putting plastic bottles. I did want to address this because this is kind
Oh,
of
I didn't see
important.
that.
Putting plastic bottles in the bottom of a container, and I would not recommend that. Any large materials like that can actually make your drainage worse because they kind of raise up where the water sits in your container. There's always like a little level where the water kind of sits at the very bottom of your container. And if you fill it with something like that, it can actually raise that up. And so you could get more of those root rot issues. So I would use something that's well draining, like a natural material, like the soil conditioner that will also break down over time, instead of something like plastic.
And we're at the end. I did find one question that I forgot to share, so I'm going to throw that last question out. And it was about how do you correctly prune roots without hurting the plant? I'm sorry, I'm a little bit past our end time. If someone can answer that before we close. So
Seeing if somebody else wants to answer.
you got it, Emily.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is, if it's a plant that doesn't transplant well, like it has a big taproot, you probably don't want to try to prune the roots. Certain plants with a fibrous root system, just like when you buy a plant in a container and it's really root bound and you can kind of break up the root ball a little bit. It's the same idea where you can, dig up the plant gently, do it on a cloudy day, a cooler day, and you can essentially prune out about a third of the root ball and then you can replant it. And that just kind of helps reduce the vigor and the size if you're trying to keep it in a container longer. You wouldn't do that for a plant that you want to grow out in the ground. It's just kind of a strategy that you can employ if you're really trying to keep those same plants in that container longer.
Thank you so much. Thanks to our speakers for answering the questions. Thanks to our participants for joining us. We have been recording this and we will send it out to our email list. And I believe we probably will post it on our CLI website as well. We'll see how that goes. So we're going to end the webinar now. And again, thank you all for your participation.